All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know we started a little bit late. Sorry for all the confusion, guys. We were just having a conversation. We didn't even realize we probably could be in a different Zoom meeting.
I was,
Um,
there's usually people waiting.
yeah, it's all good. I mean, maybe they saw my name and decided to run. I wouldn't blame them.
Oh, no,
No, just
no.
kidding. So I was actually asked to talk a little bit about sort of weed identification and rangeland situations, and usually that means noxious weeds. And I think I was asked to speak about noxious weeds specifically. But what I find is that there's a little bit of a confusion between the different definitions as to what is an invasive weed, what is a noxious weed, why are there certain weeds on the noxious weed list when there are other weeds are not included. So we're actually going to cover sort of those basics today, cover a little bit of integrated pest management strategies. What are some things that we as managers need to consider in order to be more successful as well as sustainable in our practices, which of course is the ultimate goal. And then we'll look at a couple of weeds, differing weeds from different categories that we talked about in the presentation, talk about their ID. I'll try to keep it under the original time. I know we started a little bit late, so we'll go ahead and get started. When we talk about some of these definitions, one of the first definitions we have to cover is a native plant. What exactly is a native plant? It's part of the balance of nature. It's developed over hundreds of thousands of years. It was here before the Spanish or European settlers arrived to our area. Now, what's interesting about the definition of a native plant is that could be very local. So there could be plants that are native to New Mexico that are not native to Arizona or not native to Colorado, but they were here initially. They have always been here. So that's sort of where a little bit of that confusion comes from, in that just because it's a native plant doesn't automatically mean it's native to the entirety of the United States. It may be native to only a few states or the entire Southwest. So there's a little bit of a caveat within that definition as well. In contrast, a non-native plant is a plant that was not here originally. It was introduced in some way, either on a local scale or on a continental scale, which we'll talk about that when we talk about our next definition. So, a plant that was introduced with help, either by humans, animals, weather. Some of our diseases have been introduced in those ways, insects as well. So, they didn't always come in on a shipping container somewhere or a ship somewhere from a different world. Sometimes they came in on a hurricane. So, they found a new place to habitat where it was not previously found. So native plants have always been here. Non-native plants have been introduced in some way. All non-native plants are considered to be invasive. They're introduced intentionally or accidentally. Regardless, they're still considered to be invasive. So a couple of really good examples of that would be salt cedar, kudzu. Kudzu is not necessarily specific to our area, but it's really good to talk about when we talk about the distinctions between noxious weeds, why they're so invasive. So I'll mention that a couple of other times. Another definition we need to talk about is an exotic. An exotic plant is a plant that did not originate on this continent. So when we talk about native plants and their categories, and maybe they're native to New Mexico, but they're not native to Arizona. Certain introduced and invasive species were introduced on a completely new continent. So salt cedar, for instance, is from Russia, so Asia, and Bermuda grass is from Africa. It was introduced on purpose as an alternative forage stuff for livestock that the Spanish settlers were bringing. So if it is considered to be exotic, it didn't originate here in this continent in any shape or form. So an introduced species is also considered to be an alien species, and some have become naturalized over the course of them being introduced and then sort of acclimating into our climate. They may actually become invasive beyond where they were originally placed or originally introduced on purpose. So maybe they didn't have climate barriers or natural predators to sort of keep that population in check, and therefore they sort of escaped where they were introduced, and that's how they have become invasive species. So species invasive ability is high when they become naturalized and they escape their cultivated areas. A really good example of that would be kudzu. It was introduced on purpose in the 1940s as an alternative forage for livestock in the southeast. And unfortunately, it is literally eating the South. I have a picture of that on the next, not the next slide, but the next, I believe. It's probably the poster child for weeds that have been introduced on purpose with good intentions, but have completely escaped their cultivation. And now they become such an issue, there's really nothing we can do about it at this point. And due to climate change, it is moving. So it was sort of localized within the southeast. Now it's starting to move north. Now it's starting to move west. We don't have the humidity in order to support a kudzu species, so we don't have to really worry about that in New Mexico, but it is starting to move into areas of eastern Texas where it hasn't been in the last 10 years, and that's a problem. In the worst case, as they're escaping their cultivation, as they're invading certain areas, they can actually alter the ecosystems in which they're found. Something like salt cedar, for instance, not only does it take up exorbitant amounts of water, it's actually removing salts from that water, breathing those salts out into the soil through the roots, and dropping more salts concentrated in their leaves every time it defoliates in the fall. And therefore, it's making the environment around it more salty. The reason for that being is that it's trying to create an environment where no other species can grow except for salt cedar. And when you start doing that, when you start changing the physical and chemical compositions of the soil, when you start making adjustments to your to the ecosystem surrounding, we can't get back to that native state. Even with hundreds of years of reclamation efforts, we can get close, but we'll never get back to where it was. So that's one of the issues that we're talking about with noxious weeds, and even some invasive weeds, and how they can be impactful. An invasive weed is any plant that is able to establish, grow, and spread to the point of disrupting some sort of a community, whether that's a plant community, wildlife community, human community. They're generally detrimental to the native populations of plants. They can cause an economic and environmental harm. I mentioned salt cedar. Salt cedar and Russian olive are two major noxious weeds that are responsible for draining our freshwater reservoirs, our lakes, our rivers, because they're found on the banks and they take up so much water. And that's water that we can't spare here in the Southwest. They can be harmful to human health. I'll talk about a couple of those weeds that are very specific in their toxicities, not only to humans, but to livestock as well. And again, the example of kudzu eating the South. So here we have a picture on the lower right-hand quarter. All of these leaves that you see here is kudzu. Kudzu is a vine. It grows more than a foot a day. So even if you come in and try to cut this out, it doesn't take more than a week or so for it to climb right back up. So I've seen it climbing up on telephone poles, wiring itself onto the wires in between telephone poles. That's how tenacious this plant actually is. And of course, that can be highly, highly detrimental. But again, we don't necessarily have to worry about kudzu unless we suddenly become more humid, which I don't think we will. There are native species, like we mentioned, but they can become invasive. They can be categorized as invasive depending on where it is that they're growing. So you've probably heard of the overall definition of a weed in the past, in that a weed is a plant that is growing out of place, a plant that's growing where you don't want it to. And if it does designate into that weed category, growing where you don't want it to, it is considered to be invasive. So that can even be on a localized scale. So a really good example of that would be Coulter's horseweed, something that I get asked about quite commonly in agriculture, even though it is a native plant. It has other benefits as well, but in agriculture, it's really difficult to get rid of. It's hard to control with herbicides because there aren't a lot of recommendations out there because this is indeed a native plant, but it is invasive in those agronomic systems. It's hard to harvest. It takes water and nutrients away from our plants. It can introduce diseases. It can introduce insect species that can carry diseases. So it's all part of the overall cycle. Even though it's a native plant, it can be considered invasive in certain areas. So we have to consider that as well. When you talk about invasive weeds, this is a global problem. This is not just a problem within the United States. And of course, we know that. There's significant risks to pretty much every entity that involves plants, from agriculture to ranching to industry to protected lands to residences to recreational areas to roadsides, right-of-ways, sports arenas. Everything is involved in weeds that are becoming invasive. That's why I always joke job security, because regardless of the system that you're dealing with, regardless of what your goals are for that area, I guarantee you, you're going to have weed issues. And these are issues that we need to address. Otherwise, they just become worse and worse and worse. Invasive weed species will be the #1 problem in natural forests within 10 years. I've actually been giving this presentation for about 8 years now. And I would say even 8 years ago, we were already there. Weeds, invasive weeds, cycling forest fires, grass fires. I know it was mentioned that you guys have a fire locally in your area, which I'm very, very sorry about. I really hope that you guys are able to remediate that with as little damage as possible. But we're already there. And a lot of the reasons is because of these invasive plants and why these fires are cycling so frequently now. And we'll talk about that. One of the things we have to talk about when we talk about weeds and weed issues and weed populations, when they become invasive, when they might move over into that noxious category, which we haven't talked about yet, is something called a time lag. A time lag is the time it takes for the weed to be detected in that area, or sorry, when the species is introduced, to the time when that population actually explodes in growth. It becomes an invasive plant. It becomes a problem. The longer that time lag is there, the more difficult it is going to be to control. And I have a chart that shows that here in a moment. The time lag, or the amount of time, can be variable depending on the species itself. So as you can imagine, annual weeds that only cycle once every single year, their time lag is relatively short. Whereas a longer growing or slower growing perennial plant, like say a tree, for instance, might have a longer time lag. However, even with trees, the picture that you see on the lower right-hand corner here, that's tree of heaven. Once it germinates from a seed, it can already start dropping viable seed back into your soil within 2 to 3 years. That, for a tree, is astronomically fast. So some of these trees that are considered to be more invasive, and in this case noxious, certainly have a shorter time lag than maybe some more native populations would. So here's that chart that I was talking about here. So we have the number of acres that the weed has infested, and obviously that goes up. We have the amount of time from the time that it was introduced to the time it becomes an issue to the time that we start dealing with it as an invasive population. And we have the amount of cost that's associated with the control of that weed. So as you notice, as all of these things go up, the difficulty in controlling the weed also increases. So here we have the introduction of the species into that area. If it's invasive, again, it's considered to be non-native or exotic in that sense. In some cases, maybe it's a native weed, but we're talking about, more specifically with invasive and noxious weeds here. From the time that it's introduced to the time that maybe it's first noticed or first detected, there's a time space in between that. So eradication is still feasible when the populations are small, when they're localized, when we can address them, and our management is going to be more impactful. As time increases, the amount of acres that are infested start to increase, and the amount of funding, time, feasibility, anything that's associated with the control of that weed also starts to increase. And unfortunately, public awareness of this plant being potentially problematic really doesn't occur until we're already almost at the top of this graph. So usually they say within an agricultural field, uh, uh, weed population issues aren't really noticed for the most part until about 30% of the entire field is covered with that weed. That's an issue because, again, the more widespread they get, the more mature they get, the less likely our management is going to be successful, the more it's going to cost to do that in time, feasibility, and the more likely that we're not going to be successful in eradicating that. All we can do at that point is manage it. And this is sort of the concepts behind the noxious weeds and the noxious weed list. So when we talk about noxious weeds, what is the difference between an invasive weed and a noxious weed? A noxious weed is simply a weed that is listed on a local, state, or federal level as being particularly injurious or impactful in that area. So the state of New Mexico has our own state noxious weed list. Arizona has theirs. Colorado has theirs. There might be a few overlaps in some of the weeds listed, but for the most part, they're pretty unique to our area. There's also a federal noxious weed list, and I'll talk about that. All noxious weeds, weeds that are listed on a noxious weed list, are considered to be invasive. Native plants cannot be considered on the noxious weed list. However, not all invasive plants are considered listed as noxious. Does that make sense? So there are certain weeds that are not included on the list, even though they're well known and widespread, and there's a reason for that. The reason that we have a noxious weed list is that that weed is specifically targeted for management or control because of its negative impact on economy, health, native populations, wildlife populations, wildfires, economical impacts, all kinds of different impacts that we'll talk about. There's a reason that we only have a very few specific listed weeds. The other reason is that the noxious weed list is meant to be informative. It's meant to inform the public that these are particularly problematic weeds in the state of New Mexico. So if you see them, depending on where they're listed, it may be possible to eradicate that. You need to let somebody know about it because you guys are our boots on the ground. You guys are our eyes. I have a statewide appointment. I can only see so much. But if you notice a noxious weed on your walk, then you can let your local county extension agent know, and then that agent can let me know, and then we can start putting together a plan to eradicate that weed sooner rather than later. And that's the whole point. We talk about the impacts of noxious weeds specifically. There's, of course, impacts on the plant community. Forage production yields start to go down. You have species extinction as they start pushing out some of our endangered native populations, or they're taking over complete areas entirely. There's degradation of native plant communities, changes within the ecosystem because we've lost our native plant structures. And that, of course, has, windfall impacts into other areas as well, like wildlife. So you have changes in habitat, grazing patterns, adjustments in the food chain. Even endangered species might become more endangered as a result of a change in the food chain, or the availability of the food locally in that area if you're a predator. So even though wolves might not consume plants, the food source that they rely on does. And if that food is not available, then they're going to move off site, and that impacts them as well. It really is all connected. We have watershed impacts, increases in water runoff, flash flooding events, erosion, and of course, wildfires, all as a result of these invading populations. And I'll talk about some of them here in a moment. There's also loss in recreation. Now, most people might think recreation is pretty low on the totem pole, but we like to go hunting, we like to go camping, hiking. You like to go to a park, it's for the serene aspects of being able to walk in peace in an environment that has, really nice plant structures in order to make you feel calm. There's also protected parklands, protected park areas that are being impacted by these plants, and of course, the wildlife that's contained in them. All of these are connected together in the impacts of these noxious weeds to essentially our environment. When we talk about managing noxious weeds, it's very typical to that of managing a wildfire. Prevention is going to be the key here. Of course, Smokey the Bear is very fond of this step. But if we can prevent these weeds from ever coming into our area in the first place, then we don't have to worry about it developing into a population. That's the specific purpose of one section of the noxious weed list that I'm going to talk about, and you'll figure out which one it is probably. Early detection, detecting it as soon as possible, reporting it when you've detected it. The earlier the better, because only when we've detected it, only when we've let people know, can we respond. Can we try to suppress that population as much as possible? You probably, if you've heard any of my presentations before, heard me say over and over again, early detection, rapid response. If you detect a problem, start trying to eradicate it, because the longer that we wait, the more that difficulty goes right back up, and the less likely we're even going to be successful in the first place. Once that fire has started, contamination or once the fire has started, limiting the progress of the fire is the key. Again, once the population is here, detecting it early, responding early, so that all we have to deal with is this tiny little space here rather than widespread throughout the entire state. That's the purpose of the noxious weed list. And of course, once we have the fire extinguished, what are we going to do with that area? What are we going to plant afterwards? Is it even feasible for us to do that? Because again, once you start changing the environmental conditions, you really can't get back to that native state. If you can't get back to that native state, it's possible that our native plants can no longer grow there. Our native wildlife populations can no longer inhabit there. So these are things that we really have to address when we start talking about noxious weeds, and really weeds in general. The state of New Mexico currently has 47 listed weeds on the noxious weed list. This was updated in 2020. We try to update it every 3 or 4 years. However, one of our big token positions, the range weed and brush specialist position, has been open since 2020. So we're hoping to hire that position out here pretty quickly. And once we do, we'll update the noxious weed list again. So it is always changing, and we are always adjusting to try to make sure that the weeds that are listed are represented as well as possible, especially where they're located. We'll talk about that. There is a federal noxious weed list that contains 112 listed noxious weeds, some of which include onion weed and dodder. Onion weed is the only weed that is both on the federal noxious weed list and the state noxious weed list for New Mexico. Dodder is not included on the noxious weed list in New Mexico because it's pretty widespread. A lot of people are aware of it. It's not necessarily one of those that we're trying to get people to really keep their eyes peeled as far as where these populations are showing up and how they're spreading. However, I may make an argument to add daughter to the noxious weed list once we update whenever we get that position hired out, because it is something that I get asked about quite frequently. It might be worth it to have that listed as a noxious weed. One of the other reasons for listing as far as noxious weeds go is funding and programs to try to manage these invasive populations. So you might have heard with your local Bureau of Land Management or your soil and water conservation districts that they may have programs to help the public identify, address, and control, hopefully, these types of noxious weeds. And where that funding comes from really focuses on weeds that are considered to be highly impactful to their environment, meaning they're listed on the noxious weed list. Probably not going to get a federal grant to try to control kochia for some reason, just because it's widespread, it's here. There's nothing we can really do about it except manage small areas. So here's when we start talking about the different categories of the noxious weed list. So we have Class A weeds that are not currently in New Mexico, or if they are, they're in a very limited distribution. So the whole purpose about listing weeds in the A category is that you guys are our eyes on the ground. You see a new infestation that's coming into an area, you let us know so that we can target that population and eradicate it before it becomes a problem, before it has a chance to spread. We have that ability with plants within the A category. We start moving into the B category, they start becoming more and more widespread. So they're limited to a particular area in New Mexico, maybe the Four Corners area, maybe the southern area where I'm located down here in Las Cruces, but it's not necessarily widespread throughout the state yet. So the top priority here is prevention and eradication of these small populations within those certain areas so they don't start moving more statewide and then become placed in the Class C category. Class C categories are widespread throughout New Mexico. Management decisions should really be made at a local level to try to eradicate those local areas, because you managing a certain type of Class C weed in your county, for instance, is not going to be that much impactful to all of the other weeds that are located in the other counties, but it is impactful to your county. And it might be possible to eradicate that population or at least keep it under management. That's the whole purpose of the Class C. Then we talk about the watch list. The watch list is a species of concern. They have the potential to become problematic. So this is what I was talking about with weeds that haven't necessarily come into our area quite yet, but there may be a chance of preventing them from coming into our area because we are aware of them. So more data is needed to determine if a plant should be listed. If a plant is encountered, document that location, contact your appropriate county extension agents, specialists like myself, members of NMDA and their noxious weed coordinators, your Bureau of Land Management, your Soil and Water Conservation District, any of us that have anything to do with the noxious weeds and their management, contact us and let us know so that we can hopefully keep these on the watch list and not necessarily move them into other categories, if that makes sense. So one of the things that we talk about with integrated pest management is how do we achieve successful control? Say you have a noxious weed in your area. What are some of the considerations that we need to make? Well, you've probably heard the saying, the early bird catches the worm. Well, in this case, the early bird catches the weed. The younger the weed is, the smaller the population, the easier it is to control. The more impactful your management is going to be, and it hasn't had the chance to produce any of the factors that make it invasive and make it successful season after season as an invasive weed, like say producing seed, for instance, or deep taproot systems, or spreading stems in the forms of rhizomes and stolons. Anytime you start adding those categories together, the more that you add together, the more the difficulty increases in trying to control that, because our management just can't be impactful enough to kill the entire weed. So there are certain timings, there are certain things that we need to understand about each one of these weeds. It's important to know if we're dealing with an annual or a perennial, because your management is probably going to be much more limited with perennials than there may be with annuals, because with annuals, we can do what every single year? Target them when they're young, when they're growing up from seed, because they do that every single year. The plant that produces the seed is not going to last. We just have to make sure it doesn't contribute any more seed. And then over time, that population will start to go down. We need to know its reasons for success. whether it produces a lot of seed, whether it has a deep taproot system, whether it has rhizomes, whether it has stolons. And if it has all of those categories, then those are all multiple facets that we as managers have to deal with, that we have to kill, we have to destroy in order to prevent that plant from recovering over time. And if you are dealing with a perennial plant, you can't target it when it's going to grow back from seed because it's going to be there from season to season. So what's the timing? Active growth. Periods of active growth. Usually that's going to be in the spring, usually that's going to be in the fall. Any management strategy you utilize at that point is going to be that much more impactful. And therefore, it's better bang for your buck in order to really pay attention to the biology of the weed. How do we do that? Identification. Identification is the foundation for any pest management strategy, not just weeds, but also diseases and insects as well. Don't try to manage it as a pest unless you know it actually is a pest. And only through identification will we be able to figure out if it's an annual or perennial. Does it produce a lot of seed or a deep taproot system or both? When is its period of active growth so that I can target my management for that timing rather than a timing outside of that period? Because anything outside of that period is going to be a complete waste. We're not going to be impactful enough with our management. And integrated pest management is going to be the key to that success. The thing to understand with weed management, or really pest management, is that no one management strategy by itself is going to be successful in a sustainable way. So say that you prefer to hand pull weeds rather than using a herbicide. Well, there are some weeds that respond very well to hand pulling, and there are some that don't. So while you're hand pulling all of these weeds that are really being addressed by your actions of hand pulling, what's happening? Other weeds that don't respond to it very well are moving in. We call that a population shift. So now you have a high concentration of weeds that no longer respond to hand pulling very well. What do? You have to utilize another management strategy. That's what integrated pest management is. Integrated pest management is utilizing as many management strategies as possible to cause more harm to the weed, to cause more injury, and therefore it takes it longer and is less likely for it to recover as fully. Better bang for your buck. So the other idea is that some people think that integrated pest management is management in the absence of herbicides, and that is not the case. Integrated pest management is trying all of these other management strategies first and utilizing herbicides as a last resort. Save the big guns for the big weeds, because there are certain weeds that do not respond to any other management strategy very well other than herbicides. And there are some that respond to a ton of different management strategies. You don't necessarily need herbicides. So the idea is that you can utilize prevention first, then mechanical control, then cultural control if there's escapes. And if there's escapes, then you can utilize biological control if it's even applicable. And if all of that fails, then maybe we have to resort to herbicides. And that's going to maintain our herbicides as a tool for that much longer because, of course, what's going on right now? Resistance. Resistance is getting worse every single day. Strategies should be specific to the target weed. Target the weeds when they're young. Learn about the biology as much as possible. Annual versus perennial. When is its active growth? What are some of the things that I need to prevent it from doing to keep it from spreading, like producing seed, like its taproot system? All of this is an overall integrated pest management strategy. The more that you utilize that, the more successful you're going to be. So how do you manage weeds? Well, regardless of the method that you utilize, it's going to fall under one of 5 categories. One of that is going to be prevention, highly, highly effective. If you can prevent that seed or that plant from coming into your area in the first place, that's one less weed that you have to deal with later. That's a highly effective management strategy. And that may even be purchasing more expensive seed that's certified, that's had contaminants like weed seed removed from that bag. Doesn't mean the other seed is bad. It just means that maybe it's worth a little bit more of a cost up front to make sure you don't introduce a pigweed plant that can produce 600,000 seed in one summer season, meaning it's going to spread very effectively. Clean your equipment, early detection, rapid response. We've already talked about that. Mechanical and physical, the use of tools to cause damage, to physically kill or remove that weed. Cultural practices, everything that you put into your desirable plants. So if you have a lawn or a landscape in your backyard, everything you put to make those plants as healthy and competitive as possible will help it to outcompete invading weed species. That's the whole purpose behind it. So by making your desirable plants that much more healthy, you're also helping to contribute to your weed management program because in little baby germinating seedlings can't compete as a result. I get a lot of questions on biological control, the use of fungi, the use of insects to feed on the weeds, grazing. Livestock grazing is a highly effective tool, but there's limitations within each one of these. Biological control, with the exception of some grazing instances, but especially just releasing insects into the environment to kill those weeds, are not going to kill the weed populations by themselves. They don't cause enough damage, they don't cause it quickly enough, and it's not ecologically smart for them to kill their host. Therefore, they are a useful tool in your tool bag, just like everything else in this list. They can cause a lot of damage, and then if you follow that damage with other traditional management practices, that's that much more injury you cause to that weed. Working smarter, not harder. And then, of course, chemical. The label is the law. That is not a euphemism. The label is a legally binding contract between you and the manufacturer that you are going to apply that chemical in the way that the directions tell you to. If you don't, and there's an accident or something is injured, it's the applicator's fault, right? It's a very effective means when used according to the label. The label supersedes any recommendations I could give, and the label has all the information that you need to make a safe and successful application. If you don't follow the directions of the label, that's when we start getting resistance development. That's when we start getting off-site damage. That's when we start getting environmental buildup. That's where the problems happen. 99.9% of the time is because the applicators didn't follow the label. And again, all of these are contributing to an overall integrated pest management strategy. You want to try to negate all of these first before depending on herbicides. But the more you integrate them, the more of these practices you use against that weed, the more injury you're going to cause and the less work you have to do as a manager. And the more sustainable your management is going to be as a result. If we can depend on these, maybe we don't have to depend on this nearly as much. And that's important. Weeds are categorized into 3 life cycles: annuals that grow from seed every single year. There's very specific conditions that prompt that seed to germinate. One of those is soil temperature. So even if the plant prefers warm temperatures or prefers cold temperatures, usually the soil temperature range that they prefer to germinate is going to be the same, 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. This happens several times during the course of the year. And every time it happens, it's not unusual to have both annual and summer and winter annual weeds that are germinating. What matters is what the temperatures are going to be right after that germination before it can get mature enough to drop more seed into your soil. That's where, say, in the early spring, the temperatures are a little too hot. The winter annual weeds might not get to maturity in time to drop seed. Maybe they will. But this is an indication for us as managers that when the soil temperatures are like this, especially if there's irrigation or rainfall events, then we need to be focusing on trying to get these weeds when they're young, regardless if they're summer or winter annuals. The second they drop seed into the soil, we start over from scratch. That's when they become problems in the future seasons. Biennials survive for 2 years. You have a whole 2 years to control them, right? Unfortunately, wrong. We'll talk about that. And there's also perennials, can survive for 2 or more seasons. In some cases, they can grow indefinitely as long as there's not something to kill them off. But they can survive for multiple seasons. That's what a perennial technically is. So depending on where your weed falls in its life cycle, it may be that there are certain times of the year that we have to focus on them as far as managing them as weeds. So for example, winter annuals, September through November is going to be your optimum control window because the plants are young, because those soil temperatures are starting to decrease, go through that 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit range. They're going to be young. That's going to be your time to go in there and nuke them before they ever have a chance to drop more seed into the soil. And the more plants that you kill before it drops more seed, the more seed is basically being taken out of the equation with all of the seed buildup in the soil, essentially. Target the weeds when they're young. Should you apply a herbicide to a winter annual in the spring? As with every extension answer, that has to start with the words "that depends." Did it germinate in the spring? If that's the case, then maybe it's still young in order to respond to a herbicide application. Maybe it hasn't dropped its seed yet, and therefore a herbicide application can be effective. But unfortunately, if it's germinated in the fall like it was supposed to, and we're already into the spring months, I guarantee you that plant is way too mature. It's already dropped its seed. At that point, a herbicide application is going to be a complete waste of time. All you can do at that point is pull the plant, remove them, so that hopefully it doesn't drop more seed into the soil. Most likely it already has. Same with summer annuals. The soil temperatures, they're starting to go up in the early spring. They go to that 55 to 65 degrees range. Get the plants when they're young. That's when they're going to be young. With biennials, the timing that you want to aim for is as early as possible during that first season of growth. Because at that point, they're growing as a little basal rosette, just like a dandelion. And its whole purpose is to develop a dense, deep root system. The more time that progresses, the more dense and deep that root system gets, the less likely our management is going to be successful, right? The more time that progresses, the less likely we're going to be successful. So then it overwinters. The whole purpose is to try to create a root system that can survive winter temperatures, because when it comes back in the spring, it does something called bolting. What that means is that it shoots up a stem, and at the top of the stem is where it has its flowers. Once a plant bolts, regardless if it's a biennial or an annual or a perennial, once a plant produces that stem and bolts, it is way too mature for a herbicide to control it. You have to utilize other management strategies. Herbicide application is going to be a complete waste. With perennials, we don't have the opportunity to get them when they're young because they're not growing from seed every season. So what do we have to focus on? Periods of active growth. So when we talk about perennials, the optimum time is usually going to be in the fall. If you think about a dandelion, in the fall, it knows that winter is coming, therefore it's moving all of its growth, its carbohydrates into its root system. If we disrupt that process, it leaves the roots susceptible to damage from cold winter temperatures. Or if you're spraying a herbicide, it goes straight to the root system and it kills the root, which is what we want to do with perennial plants. Same in the spring. It's not focusing on its roots, it's focusing on its leaves. If we interfere with that process, we pull it, we scrape it away with a hoe, we hit it with a herbicide, it's going to have to use its root systems, its stored carbohydrates in order to produce more leaves. Lather, rinse, repeat until it doesn't come back. That's what I mean by periods of active growth, and whatever we do to manage it being much more impactful, as opposed to a dandelion in the summer that's completely shut down and in survival mode. We don't want that. So we are getting a little bit late here on time. So I do have this arranged in a way that if we didn't have a whole lot of time to focus on the plants themselves, if you want a copy of this presentation, shoot me an email. My email is going to be on the last slide of the presentation. I'm happy to send you a PDF copy, but each one of these slides has multiple pictures of the identification features that are listed here in the middle that will help you with identification of this specific type of plant if I don't have time to go through them individually. They're also categorized by whether or not they're introduced invasive, whether or not they're native invasive plants, whether or not they're noxious weeds. If they are noxious weeds, where are they listed, what category, and what life cycle do they have? So it's basically the best way that I can talk about identification features in the plant themselves in one slide. And I like the way they're arranged. So here we have kochia, a plant that is an introduced invasive, meaning it is not a native. It came from Canada, in a sense. No, it did come from Canada, pardon me. So it is not native, it is invasive, and it's not included on the noxious weed list because it's a pretty common weed. A lot of people know what kochia looks like, so it doesn't benefit us from including it in a list of all of these other weeds. We want you to focus on a succinct number of weeds that are particularly impactful. And unfortunately, if we include every weed that's considered to be invasive and widespread and well-known, the noxious weed list could have 300 to 400 listed weeds on them. That's not going to benefit everybody because certain plants will get lost in the weeds, so to speak. And that's why we have a noxious weed list and we have other plants that we consider to be invasive. So here we have a native invasive that's very commonly referred to me through the plant diagnostic clinic for identification, asking me for control, especially in agronomic systems, and that's silverleaf nightshade. The reason being is that every part of the plant is toxic. Your livestock accidentally eats the berries, they're going to get sick. However, all of these plants also have benefits as well. So a lot of the plants that we consider to be invasive, whether they're native or introduced, have benefits that we have to consider as well. With silverleaf nightshade, there's a lot of medicinal purposes. You can use the berries in order to make rennet, in order to make cheese, or as the rennet in order to make cheese. There are a lot of benefits that you kind of have to weigh as far as the pros and cons. And if somebody considers this to be a really great plant because of its pretty flowers, they're not wrong. However, if they do consider it to be invasive in a certain area, even though it's native, they're not wrong either. So it's just that's where the subjectivity of the term weed comes into play here. One person's desirable plant may be the other person's arch nemesis, James Bond villain, if you will. Just depends on what your objectives are and what it's actually doing in that area. So here's a native invasive that I do actually want to touch on just quickly. So a lot of people want to preserve our milkweed species, and they should because they are the primary food source, the only food source in most cases, especially for pollinators, especially monarch butterflies. Unfortunately, there are certain areas in which milkweeds cannot exist, and that is in forage areas or pasture areas. The reason being is that even though this is a native perennial milkweed plant, this specific milkweed, world milkweed, is so toxic to horses that even in a dried hay bale, one of these plants is enough to cause injury or maybe even kill a horse. It's that toxic. All milkweed species are toxic to livestock. So you can grow as much milkweed as possible. Just make sure that the seed aren't spreading into areas where an agronomic forage crop is growing. Because if you have milkweed in that crop, you can't harvest it because of the toxicity factors. You also don't want it to get into pasture areas. So it's appropriate in some areas and it is not appropriate in others. So we have to find that balance of keeping it there, keeping it abundant enough for our pollinators, especially um, our monarch butterflies. But we have to make sure we're not killing our livestock at the same time, or at least making them very, very sick. Camel thorn is a very aggressive. This is where we're starting to get into the Class A perennials. It is here in New Mexico, but it is really focused in the Four Corners area, maybe even the northern section of the state, although it is starting to move south. This is such a tenaciously growing perennial vine in a sense that I've actually seen pictures of camel thorn growing underneath the carpet of a person's living room. That same person, unfortunately, also had camel thorn growing out of the light fixtures in their bathroom because it was moving behind the walls. That's how tenacious this is in its growth. As a result, it's pretty difficult to control, so we really want to keep those populations as localized as possible or eradicate them if we can. That's going to be difficult. Yellow toad flax, butter and eggs. This is the first example of a plant that is listed on the noxious weed list that probably has been planted on purpose. This is present in a lot of landscape situations because of the really beautiful snapdragon-like flowers. The only problem is that it has underground rhizome systems, so it spreads very easily. Management is difficult because you can't get to all of the rhizomes underneath the ground, and if the rhizome survives, the plant survives. So our management is going to be very limiting because we just can't reach enough of the plant to cause that much damage. The other thing is that this plant produces a copious amount of seed every single season. So it might be planted on purpose because it's pretty, but likely within the next season or two, it's going to start escaping cultivation. And it's hard to keep it contained as a result. Here we have Malta star thistle, which is a Class B summer biennial. So it's very noticeable as a result of these wings extensions along the stems. The primary problem with Malta star thistle on top of livestock toxicity is it has a singular taproot system. So when you have Malta star thistle or yellow star thistle that are taking over entire acreages, areas, nothing but 100% coverage, unfortunately, those singular taproots channel water as rainfall events occur. And what happens? Erosion is highly, highly enhanced as a result of nothing but taproots that are present. So our native grasses can't grow in those areas. They're being choked out by the invasive weed. They don't have the grassy netted root system to hold that soil into place. Therefore, erosion just goes gangbusters. Bull thistle, Class B, biennial. Most of your invasive noxious thistles are going to be in the biennial category. So bull thistle, musk thistle, Scotch thistle. The only thistle that's on the noxious weed list that is not a biennial is Canada thistle. And that's usually going to be in the northern portion of the state around Taos or the Four Corners area. But as far as these types of thistles goes, there's probably a reason this is called bull thistle. Look at those spines. They're very sharp. They can get through clothes. They can get through animal fur. Very, very detrimental. Another reason why if there's a high concentration of thistles in the area, especially bull thistle, wildlife is going to seek forage elsewhere. And that's where we get that displacement from wildlife populations. I included African rue just because even though it is a Class B perennial, so it is relatively localized to the southern portion of the state. I included it because of the of I-25 and the movement of trucks in our area. It is starting to move north. And that's a problem because every part of this plant is toxic. The roots, the leaves, the flowers, and especially the berries and the seeds. And when I say toxic, I mean toxic to pretty much every organism because it has four separate alkaloids that contribute to its toxicity. So if there's an alkaloid that's heavily toxic to cattle but not horses, there's another alkaloid that is toxic to horses. So it encompasses pretty much everything, including humans, including bird species, including wildlife, and including our livestock. So this is a plant that you do not want in your area. So if you do manage to locate it, eradicate it as quickly as you possibly can. Cheatgrass is one that I did want to mention because this is one of the plants that is contributing specifically to the occurrences of wildfires in New Mexico. Um, it loves fire. It's usually dry at a time when our native species are starting to come out of dormancy in the spring. This is a winter annual weed, even though it can grow in the summer as well. And it loves fire. Fire actually activates the seed in order to germinate, and it germinates so quickly afterwards that our native plants can't keep up, and therefore it's taking over entire areas. The other thing is that these awns, you can see they're very long and they're very sharp. If you've been hiking anywhere in New Mexico and you get these long spikes in your jeans, in your shoelaces, in your socks, that's downy brome or cheatgrass. Sorry. And therefore, if you're a foraging wildlife or livestock, you get that in your mouth, it can actually pierce through their cheeks, it can pierce through their esophagus, through their stomachs. They're that sharp and that long. The other contributing factor is that even though this is a winter annual grass that has a very shallow, spindly little root system, those roots can pull water and nutrients out of the soil to such an obscene degree that the soil is forever changed. And it is forever changing the plant populations in our native meadows and prairie lands. Because unfortunately, when you start again changing the ecosystem, our native plants can't compete, and therefore the native plants can't grow in that area. So it's not as easy as just getting rid of the downy brome. You have to be able to incorporate other plants into that area. And if there's no nutrients or moisture present in the soil, you can't do that. Russian knapweed is one that we recently, last time we met, actually moved from the B category of the noxious weed list to the C because it is becoming more and more widespread. The reason being is that it has an underground taproot system that grows up to 40 feet deep. And then from that root system, other rhizomes can expand horizontally a further 40 feet, giving rise to other plants. So it takes over areas incredibly fast. And because of those underground root systems, because they're so deep, because they're so expansive, our management just really can't compete. So it's really hard to control this weed, especially in the absence of herbicides. The other contributing factor to it being on the noxious weed list is that it gives livestock, especially horses, something called Chewing's disease. It is a neurological disease if the horse accidentally consumes this plant, where something is going on with their brain that they can take in other forage, but they can't chew it. If they can't chew it and they can't consume it, ultimately the animal dies. Jointed goat grass, I won't focus too much on. It is becoming a little bit more, it is pretty widespread, more so than I initially thought when I started this job. Highly identifiable by these very segmented little grass seeds as far as like the entire seed head goes. It looks like little Legos that you can stack on top of each other. Really problematic only for the most part if you have a wheat field, if you're trying to grow wheat as a crop, because this can actually cross-pollinate with wheat. And basically, it goes through multiple seasons where it becomes a little bit more jointed goat grass, and then all of a sudden it starts phasing back out from jointed goat grass back to wheat. Unfortunately, when it's in those stages, it is a sterile plant, and therefore your wheat seed, your actual seed heads themselves are not going to be as nutritionally beneficial, and they're not going to be able to seed other areas. Musk thistle, another thistle. It's again similar to bull thistle, a biennial. This is Class C. It's more widespread than bull thistle is. The thing with thistles is that you have to look at the features of the leaves. Musk thistle is entirely smooth and it has these little frosted tips like most boy bands did in the 90s. In contrast, bull thistle, if you were to take your thumb and very carefully rub the top portion of the leaf, it would be scratchy with hairs, almost like a cat's tongue. And if you were to look at the bottom of the leaf, again, very carefully, it would be almost cottony or downy in the soft hairs that are present. So that's one of the primary differences between musk thistle and bull thistle, because you want to control it when it's in this rosette stage and not after it bolts, as you see here. Once it bolts, can't utilize herbicides. They're way too mature. It's not going to control the weed. You have to think of you have to utilize another management strategy. Either dig it up or take a pair of scissors and cut these little flowers off so they can't produce seed. The thing about annuals and the things about biennials is they only reproduce by seed. How do we control them? Prevent seed. Anything you can do to prevent it from dropping more seed into the soil is going to be more beneficial. Can trees be weeds? Absolutely. Siberian elm and tree of heaven are probably two of the most prominent ornamental-ish trees that are on the noxious weed list, the other being Russian olive. Russian olive is a gorgeous tree. It has that bluish gray foliage, smells great. Siberian elm, you've got these very segmented, very evenly distributed, it seems like, leaves along the stems. It can grow into a very attractive looking tree. The problem is these seeds right here. Each one of these trees can produce about 1,000,000 seed. And just like Tree of Heaven that I mentioned earlier, if it germinates from a seed, it's probably already dropping more seed back into the soil within about 2 to 3 years after it germinates, which is astronomically fast. Unfortunately, both with Tree of Heaven and Siberian elm, you can't just cut it off at the trunk. Everything above it's going to die, but what is it going to do? It's going to send up suckers from the roots. Stems that have their own leaf systems, and once they develop their own roots, they can survive completely independent of the plant, of the root system that produced them. Therefore, you have all these suckers coming up around the tree, even though you cut down the primary tree. That's the problem with Tree of Heaven and Siberian elm. It can be highly, highly damaging to infrastructure. Those seedlings can come up so tenaciously, either by seed or by suckers, it can look like a jungle is suddenly occurring around your home. It can damage your foundation. It can damage other structures. These are not beneficial trees. Both of them also have what we call allelopathic compounds. Russian knapweed has this as well, the one that has the Chewing's disease that I mentioned earlier. Allelopathic compounds are compounds that are released by the root systems or the plant into the soil that is toxic to other surrounding plants. Essentially, it's creating its own little ecosystem where only it can grow and other plants can't grow into that area. Both Tree of Heaven and Siberian elm have these allelopathic compounds. So it may be that other plants in your landscape or the trees in your landscapes can't grow in that area, and they very easily push out our native tree species. That's the problem with these types of noxious trees. I do want to touch on this plant before we end tonight. Myrtle spurge, it's on the watch list. Even though it's pretty widely distributed throughout New Mexico, I actually had this in my backyard because I rented this property, and now I don't want to have to deal with trying to get rid of it. The reason being is that it is highly, highly toxic. So this plant is very commonly found in landscape systems because it's highly drought tolerant. It's very attractive. It's a succulent looking plant. The flowers bloom in the early spring, just like dandelions, which is beneficial for pollinators. It requires very, very little water or maintenance in order to keep it alive. So what's the problem? Well, like every other spurge plant, anytime you break the leaves, you break the stems, you break the flowers, you break the seed pods, there's a milky sap. And the milky sap of this particular spurge species is highly, highly caustic, or corrosive, meaning that if you get it on your skin, you can get raised blisters, almost like a really bad sunburn or second-degree burns. Most importantly, you don't want to ingest it because it can make you very ill, and in some cases, if you ingest enough of it, it can kill you. The other thing is that if you get it on your hands or you get it on your gloves, or if you're trying to get rid of it and you're trying to protect your hands from the sap, you accidentally get it in your eyes, it can blind you. It has blinded several children in the Four Corners area when they were just playing around their development. They get the sap on their clothes, they get the sap on their hands from their clothes, and what do kids do when they get tired? They rub their eyes. In fact, about 6 years ago, I was giving a master gardener talk in Santa Fe where one of the master gardeners mentioned that they had gotten myrtle spurge sap in their eyes about 15 years prior to that and still had debilitating pain because basically it just melts your corneas away. So this is again where that term weed comes into factor here. It's a beautiful drought tolerant landscape plant, or maybe if you have kids or if you have pets that are commonly in your landscape, you don't want to accidentally, make them sick or give them blisters or blind them. So it really becomes that juggling match of whether it's a beneficial or whether it's a weed. That's the reason it's included on the noxious weed list and it's on the watch list, even though it's widespread throughout the state because it's commonly placed there on purpose. But it can escape cultivation. One of the more popular areas or famous areas that I've seen it escape, or sorry, one of the most notable places that I've seen it escape cultivation in my experience has been up in Taos. In fact, I was just there in early June, and this plant is basically running amok in an area surrounding a daycare. That's probably a pretty bad combination, I would imagine. And it's escaping cultivation. They tried to get out there and get volunteers to try to manage it, and they just can't keep on top of it. So it does have the ability to spread as well. Yellow blue stem is another one of those on the watch list. That a lot of the old world blue stems are, even though I've seen it in New Mexico. There's actually an example of the plant growing right out here outside of my office. It is here. If you can try to get rid of it before the population starts to grow, I would suggest it just because it's really difficult to get rid of if it is invading into your area. It's not necessarily a palatable forage for our livestock, and it has those extensive underground root systems that make it that much more difficult to control. If you find yourself overwhelmed, don't be afraid to ask for help. Where do you ask for help from? Well, your local county extension agent is a great place to start. If they don't know, they can ask specialists like myself. I am actually the director of the plant diagnostic clinic here on campus at New Mexico State University. So if you have a plant, whether you're located in New Mexico or Arizona or Colorado, you have a plant, you don't know if it's a weed, you don't know what the identification is, so you don't know how to manage it effectively, shoot me a picture, shoot me or mail me an example of that plant. I'd be happy to identify it for you. At the plant clinic, we identify plants and weed species. We also identify plants with disease symptomology. If they're abiotic symptoms or actual diseases, we can plate those out. And we also have an entomologist that will help with plant-related insect issues. So if you have insects that are invading into your garden, you don't know what they are, you don't know how to control them, send us some pictures, send us some samples. You can access that at the website here at the bottom of your screen. Again, if you want a copy of this presentation, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to send you a PDF of it. I know we had to go through it really quickly, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you. I like to start off with the questions.
Sure.
So we have the watch list. Uh, in reference to the S curve, are the plants on the watch list kind of in the exponential part? Like we don't know their ecological effects yet, but we know they're there. Is that
They
fair to
can
say?
be. So the watch list is kind of it's a really good question because the watch list is kind of a wild card in the sense of where they are on the noxious weed list. So usually they're on the watch list because if they are present, we don't really necessarily know the environmental impacts. Maybe there's localized toxicity issues, like I mentioned with myrtle spurge, even though it's
Okay.
widespread throughout the state. Like
Mm,
with the old world blue stems, like that yellow blue stem that I showed,
yeah.
it is present in New Mexico. It is problematic if you're trying to eradicate it from a certain area, from a certain livestock situation or a forage situation. But for the most part, we just really don't know its economic impact as of yet. So it kind of sticks around in the watch list. So
Okay.
the watch list is sort of a mixed bag depending on what the plant actually is and how it's being designated as a potential to be on the noxious weed list. Of course, with myrtle spurge, that's going to be the toxicity factors. And
Hmm.
the yellow blue
Hmm.
stem is going to be the difficulty in control and the ability to take over large scale forage and pasture areas and push out our native species
Wow.
and
Okay.
our
Good.
other forageable and palatable species, if
Thank
that
you.
makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. Okay.
Good
Um,
question.
Another question. Um, in your reference to herbicides, you said that some plants can become it's not as or some herbicides can't be effective. Are there certain herbicides that plants can overcome? Like, so there's various biological components that herbicides affect. Is there a
Hmm.
certain category that plants can beat?
So, another good question. In the way that they can quote unquote beat them, the way that
Uh-huh.
they're doing that is really through the resistance issue.
Okay.
So, the development of resistance, a lot of people think it's just a rate issue. So,
Uh-huh.
when they go out and make a herbicide application, it didn't control the plant. So, what's the next thing we do? We put more in the tank, right?
Okay. Uh-huh.
So, like
Mm-hmm.
more herbicide doesn't kill it deader. So
Mm-hmm.
resistance is actually a biological or metabolic change within the plant itself. So it does not recognize the herbicide anymore. Either it
Mm.
burns it off before it can get to the site where it has to go. So say if it mimics growth hormones, it
Okay.
has to get
Okay.
to an area that's producing growth hormones in order to work. If it doesn't get there, it doesn't work. It doesn't cause any type of injury. So if the plant burns that off before it gets there, or if it has a little space that it can localize that area until the
Uh-huh.
plant can burn it off where there aren't any growth hormones. So it's a change within the plant itself that's causing the herbicide to no longer be effective or recognized by the weed itself.
Interesting. Okay.
And so
Okay.
resistance is not a rate issue. In fact, I did some
Mm-hmm.
research when I was at Purdue University, looking at the exponential curve and trying to determine resistance factors. And in one species that I was looking at of crabgrass, I applied the herbicide rate up to 300 times the label rate, and it didn't cause any injury, no
Nothing.
yellowing, no nothing.
Wow.
So adding more to the tank is not the issue. So we have herbicides that have designated ways or
Mm-hmm.
categories or modes of action. So
Mm-hmm.
basically groups
Mm-hmm.
in how they cause injury to the plant. So we have herbicides that mimic growth hormones. We
Mm-hmm.
have herbicides that prevent the development of auxin, which is needed for energy for the cell. We have herbicides that block photosynthesis
Yeah.
production. So, or the ability from the roots to grow, things like that. And so resistance is usually a factor of overcoming one of those categories. And in many cases, it's not unusual for it to basically become resistant to all the type of herbicides within that category that cause that same amount of
Interesting.
injury.
Okay.
And so that's the primary way in which weeds kind of fight back as far as the herbicide
Oh.
developments go. Now, there's other factors that can cause a herbicide to not work. So, say environmental conditions were not appropriate, it was too hot, it was too dry, it was too windy.
Mm-hmm.
My experience is that the most herbicide mistakes occur when a herbicide is applied to a plant that is too mature. It is
Oh.
not the right weed for that type of
Uh-huh.
herbicide because some herbicides are very selective, or the herbicide just wasn't applied in the correct way. So, but the maturity factor is a big issue because if you don't kill the plant with a herbicide, it is
Mhm.
technically a wasted application. And so
Okay.
one of the ways that we deal with that is we make multiple applications over the course of one season. But if we can time that application to when that plant is actively growing or when it's young, like I mentioned in the
Mhm.
presentation, it may
Yes.
be that we don't need those further applications of the herbicides, and therefore we curtail the development of resistance. We put less of the herbicide out into the environment when it's not needed. So those are kind of the big ways in which weeds fight back.
Got it. Very interesting.
Sorry,
I
that was a
find
long-winded explanation, but
no, it's good. It's extra info that's needed to fill my gap in
yeah,
my knowledge.
it's all good.
But just fascinated by all the alkaloids that plants produce. There's
Oh
just a
yeah.
plethora of them, and some of them target insects and
Mm-hmm.
various mammals. So very cool.
Plants are so much smarter than we are. Like they
Seriously,
don't have little brains or anything like that, but I am constantly learning and in awe of what plants are capable of doing in order to survive. It's amazing to me.
fascinating. Yep.
And weeds especially, they're the ultimate survivors.
You're right.
They
So
will
that's all
exist in
my
the dystopian
questions.
future that we're probably preparing for.
So if anybody else has any other questions, those were my questions. Thank you for the informative talk.
My pleasure. And as I said, if anybody wants a copy of the presentation, I don't know if you want to offer it to the group that wasn't able to make it tonight. Like I said, I know you guys have got a lot of things that you're having to address and deal with, especially in the form of the wildfires and stuff like that. So,
Yeah,
like I
it's
said, my
bittersweet.
my thoughts, and if you're so inclined, my prayers are with you guys. I really hope that y'all can remediate that with very little damage.
We're
But
praying. Thank you.
Those weeds, man, they contribute.
No, which made me think of other stuff. Yeah, like what about after the fire? So
I
the weeds
know.
popped up.
Again, after the fire, what do we do? Like usually
Yeah,
it's the weeds that
exactly.
come in. It's not as easy as just throwing out some wildfires, wildflower seeds, and everything's just Alice in Wonderland after that. It's just that's just not how it works.
So, if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to ask while we have Dr. Leslie Beck. I'm going to send out a poll regarding the presentation. So please take a few minutes to fill out the poll and any questions, please.
Please do.
Greatly
Thank you so
appreciate.
much. I'm sorry for going over time.
No, no, it was our tech error. I knew something was wrong when there was nobody waiting. Um, so the poll is up for everybody to fill out. I greatly appreciate your responses. If, if everybody's still with us, we got three, four, five.
I appreciate it. Do we have a comment in the chat? Oh,
Oh,
thank you. Yes. Appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am. If anybody has any questions after the fact, or if the group has a question that if they watch the video and they come up with a question, feel free to email me. That's essentially what my job is, to answer questions all day.
I'm
So I
gonna
love it.
definitely keep track of your info. Oh, one more question. Are you in the Millennium Falcon? Is that what your
Yeah.
background is?
I
Okay.
am.
I thought it might be a jet fighter.
Oh yeah, this is my COVID background, which I probably should put to something a little bit more professional, but nah.
Yeah, it's cool. Like
I
something
still
with
get pretty good comments on
maybe a
it, so I like
Jurassic
it.
Park background.
Oh, I
Just
think we have a raised
oh
hand
yeah,
if somebody wants to
yes.
unmute and ask a question, or
Mr. Gorman.
Thank you. I just had a question about where we could continue to like learn more or how we start. So I have a job that where we do like conservation projects in public
mm-hmm,
lands. And like one thing I've experienced with is like tamarisk removal.
mm-hmm.
And we do a lot of like invasive species removal for like spring water restoration, but I guess like, I don't know too much about like the weeds and the plants. I know more about like the trees and how that affects like the environment, but I'm still new to having or like looking at weeds and stuff like that and some of the smaller flowering plants. So
Sure.
um I'm just curious as to where I can start learning more about this and how I can I guess like broaden my knowledge. Because I do a lot of work with invasive, noxious and all sorts of plants, but I'm still new to this realm.
Oh, no, that's fantastic. So a really great place to start from a local level, I think would be really is can't talk. My brain shut down for the night. Is to get in touch with your local Bureau of Land Management and your soil and water conservation district. Usually they'll have a really good idea of what a lot of the weed specific issues are in your area, which weeds contribute to that, and if they have any programs that might help with that. I guarantee will have materials that will help with some of the identification of these weeds, of course. But they may be able to sort of steer you into the categories of weeds that you might want to be on the lookout for. Of course, if you're ever out on a job or on a site and you see a plant that you don't know if it's a weed or you're not exactly sure what it is, feel free to shoot me a couple of pictures, or if you want to get in touch with your local county extension agent, maybe they can help you with identification. If they can't, they can always send me samples that we can help with identification. And of course, once we have the plant identified, then that will, help to develop an overall management strategy that's going to be successful as well as sustainable. Um, there are a couple of workshops and conferences that might be present within your area. So you might contact your local county extension agent to see if there's any master gardeners trainings for weeds that you want to attend. If you have any pesticide applicator trainings, for applicators that are seeking continuing education credits for their applicator's license to maintain that from year to year. Um, Oops, didn't mean to do that. Usually there's got to be a weeds talk in there somewhere. So usually that will be a little bit more updated information as to, research wise, if I'm giving a presentation, what herbicides worked well on this, what were we looking at, what were the results of that. Um, and it can range anywhere from basic plant identification to how hard water or water quality might impact the efficacy of your herbicide. If you're interested in that, I have a presentation I can send you on that. that shows you, how to recognize those signs and how to mitigate that so that you're not reducing the effectiveness of your herbicide just by mixing it in hard water before you even apply it to a plant. There's also workshops and conferences that are taking place across the state. So in August 5th and 6th, we are actually putting together a noxious invasive plant short course in Santa Fe. If you're interested in the website or the registration for that, shoot me an email. I can send that to you. That's going to be a really comprehensive 2-day presentation of multiple um, specialists, multiple experts in their field in weed management, mitigation, identification techniques, specifically focusing on noxious weeds. So there are quite a few opportunities for further education on the subject. Um, like I said, I would just keep in touch with your local extension offices and your Bureau of Land Management, your Soil and Water Conservation District. They would also be aware of the short course and any workshops that are going on as well. So that would be a really good place to start from a local perspective, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I would certainly be interested in all of the workshops and all the other programs that are here. So
Oh, sure. Shoot
I'll
me an email
definitely
and I'd be happy to send
email.
you the registration site and everything like that. So that's a good place to start. And I guarantee you, in going to that conference, you can make partnerships and get to meet other specialists and experts in their field with noxious weeds, and they may even have more resources that can help.
Thank you. I appreciate all the information. Thank you for showing these flyers.
My pleasure.
I'll probably be requesting the slides for sure, for all of these different programs and our what we learned. So thank you.
No
I hope all of
problem.
you.
Sure thing. And if you didn't get my email from the last slide, Terrell and Michaela also can get in touch with me. So you can also just Google my name and weeds and NMSU.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about our upcoming
Oh,
events. We do have a
got it.
conservation plan planning. Sorry, I'm in a library and they're closing at 7, so I'm about to get kicked
Ah,
out.
got it. I get it.
Apologize, everybody. So we have a conservation planning workshop coming up July 6th, and it's going to be at the Standing Rock Chapter House from 1 to 3 on July 6th. So mark that on your calendar. And also, there's going to be an agricultural science field day center here in Farmington at the Ag Science Center near Nappy. It's going to be July 24th. It's going to be from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. So if you're free, please come on out and visit our booth and see all the interesting agricultural technology that's taking place at the Ag Science Center.
I will
So,
say in Farmington, you also have a phenomenal agricultural extension agent in the form of Bonnie Hopkins. So
oh, yes,
she
thank
really
you.
knows her stuff. She's a friend of mine, and she can get in touch with me if you have any additional questions. So she would be a great resource as far as like the plants that are around and what's going on as far as like workshops and conferences you can attend. And I know she works with you guys as well. So she's
All
great.
right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to head and end the webinar. Thank you again for presenting the weeds. We appreciate you. Thank you, Dr. Leslie Beck, and
Thank you.
have a good evening, everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Stop recording. Oh,
All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave the meeting now. That's all right.
okay.
Thank you,
No, no,
sir.
no. Have a good
Nice
evening.
to meet you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you again for your patience. And this is the Rangeland Weed Identification Management. We're looking at weeds of New Mexico. And we have our presenter, Dr. Leslie Beck from New Mexico State University, who's a weed extension specialist. And I'm your host, Terrell Yazzie. And I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next one. Again, we're Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project, and we're an extension of New Mexico State. And we are funded by the USDA's outreach to assist ranchers and farmers who are in the category of socially disadvantaged or veteran farmers. And our project aims to improve operations, profitability, and mainly sustainability. And our target population are the Navajo people, ranchers and farmers, and increase their knowledge and the use of USDA programs and services, and just to increase the local production and consumption of traditional foods. And